My name is Jayant Bhandari, and I want to welcome you to this year's Capitalism and Morality seminar. When I first launched this seminar in 2010, I was asked by the university events manager whether hosting a libertarian, I asked her if hosting a libertarian gathering here at the campus would be acceptable. I wasn't sure if these kind of viewpoints would be acceptable here. And I really believe that she was quite a lefty, so I wanted to make sure she wasn't going to create any troubles for me. But in the spirit of Western culture, she was a very open-minded person. She right away responded to me that what you discuss inside the room was your business. And this was, again, despite the fact that I had lived in the West for a long time, these things continue to shock me. Back then, those days, the university required me to use their videographer to record the event. And they used to charge quite a bit of money. And I told the events manager that, hey, I can't afford to pay you that money. And her response was, what you do inside the room is none of my business. And I heard that many times over my life in the Western society, where even bureaucrats are able to bend rules to do the right thing. I grew up in a hellhole, and you are witnessing the arrival of that hellhole in Canada slowly. And I've talked about it for many years. Today, is a new kind of dysfunctionality. I see the IT guy was missing, the coffee was missing, so we are half an hour late as a result. Unlike a lot of people in this audience, I see things very differently because I grew up in a hellhole. For me, the real divide is not between socialism and capitalism. People in this kind of audience argue ad nauseum about Swedish socialism versus American capitalism. For me, the divide is between savagery and civilization. That is the real divide, and I think Western people really will have a reckoning with that over the next few years because of what they have done over the last few decades. I, of course, no longer live in Vancouver as a result because I see what is coming. Now, those were also very safe days. When I moved to Vancouver 2010, when I started the seminar, or when I moved to Vancouver 20 years back, it was a very safe city. Major crimes were unknown. And much has changed since then. And because I come here every 6 months, it visibly looks like a different city. For the first time, and again, I referred to the events manager. She told me she didn't really care what I did inside the room. This year, I had to complete a security questionnaire, which required me to tell them if I bring in controversial people, if I bring politically connected people. And of course, I don't, as you know. But things are changing very rapidly, and this scares me. I guarantee you within a few years, you will start having problems with air conditioning, and then you will have electricity going off, and it isn't too far away. You don't see it, I see it, because I know what systemic crises are about. I really hope the larger Canadian society listens to what the speakers here have to say today. Our schedule is very tight. We are about 35 minutes late today. I will cut that time from the lunch time, and I will keep the introductions of my speakers very short to allow them to have as much time as possible. I want to invite my first speaker, Stephan Kinsella. He's a libertarian attorney and intellectual property expert from Houston. And he's the author of many books and publications: International Investment, Political Risk, Dispute Resolution, Against Property Rights, etc., etc. And he is also one of the key person at Dr. Hans Hoppe's conference that happens every year in Turkey. So I want to invite Stephan Kinsella. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Giant. Let me grab my notes here. I'm going digital too. Okay. All right. Very glad to be here. It's always impressive to me to be at an event on like a Saturday morning with professional working people busy, and listening to a patent attorney talk about property rights for no credit. You're not even forced to be here. As for controversial speakers, I spoke twice at Yale and once at Berkeley, and there were no protesters. I'm almost a little offended because my talks are so innocuous. People don't know that they're really radical, but they don't sound radical. People aren't that worked up about intellectual property or property rights. They don't understand the implications. So I'm glad to be here, very glad to be here. I've known Giant for many years and spoken many times over the years. I'm not a great speaker, as you'll discover, but I don't get I used to get nervous, but I don't get nervous anymore, maybe because I'm old and I don't care, or maybe I know the topic well enough at this point. I did a PowerPoint, but I'm not going to show it just to organize my thoughts. So I sometimes start out with a joke, and I was going to skip the joke today because people will groan and because you might have heard it before, but this is a new audience. So one joke I use in this topic before is, why do anarchists drink herbal tea? Because proper tea is theft. See? I got the groans. I have a little more fresh humor coming in a minute. So I'm from Louisiana, a civil law state in America. I live in Texas now, and I've been a libertarian for about 45 years, since high school. I'm a patent attorney in Houston now, kind of a retired patent attorney now, and a longtime libertarian writer. I was influenced by Ayn Rand in the beginning, and then later heavily by Mises and Rothbard and Hoppe. So I'm basically an anarcho-Austrian libertarian thinker and writer. I did start after law school writing on a lot of libertarian theory topics, and I've done a lot of that over the years, like contract theory and rights theory and causation and intellectual property. And I'm most well known in libertarian circles because I started writing on intellectual property as well in the mid-1990s. And the reason is because I started in oil and gas law in Houston in 1992, but then I quickly switched to patent law because the market was better, and I had an engineering degree and wanted to move to Philadelphia, which I was able to do with a patent law career. So I switched from oil and gas law, which I loved, to patent law. And I figured, well, I'm writing on all these topics about libertarian theory, and libertarian arguments on intellectual property they always nagged at me because there was something wrong with them. Like Ayn Rand wrote something in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, about how she was in favor of patents and copyrights, but unlike other property rights, it's okay for them to expire after a finite period of years, like 17 years for a patent and 100 or so years for copyright. And it never made sense to me that you favor what is supposed to be a natural right, even though it expires at a certain point in time. So the arguments didn't make sense to me, but I figured, well, I'm a rising libertarian writer. I'm also a practicing attorney and a patent lawyer, and I understand the patent law, unlike almost everyone else who writes about it, even economists. It's a very arcane topic. Maybe I can solve the problem, and maybe I can come up with a better theory of IP and put it on a solid footing. Sort of like from my Catholic days, trying to be the guy that would find a good argument for God finally, and giving up on that too. And like that, I gave up. I also gave up on IP when, after several years of deep research and thinking, I realized I kept failing in my attempts to come up with a good argument for IP, and that was because I was trying to do something, paraphrasing Walter Block's books, justify the unjustifiable. And once I switched my thinking to think, well, maybe I'm trying to justify something that can't be justified, I'll get the solution then. And I did. Everything fell into place. So I concluded that all forms of patent law, and that's not going to be the subject of my brief talk today. But that's how I came to that conclusion, right? But to do that, I had to, and by the way, so 2 years ago, I published those theories and all my other theories that I have published on in the last, say, 29 years in my book, Legal Foundations of Free Society. So this book has sort of a compendium of all my ideas on libertarian legal theory, including intellectual property. But in any case, in order to figure the IP issue out, right, it required me to rethink a lot of things that we take for granted. The common sense concepts of property, justice, law, to disentangle that and come to the right solution. So in a sense, trying to solve that one puzzle, which is not my favorite intellectual activity, is intellectual property, by the way. I did it for a living, and I had to figure it out to write about it, but I prefer the other topics, causation and rights theory and ethical theory and economics. But I had to focus on that because I was the only one who really could, because it's hard to know enough about economics, free market economics, libertarian theory, law itself, intellectual property law, and all these issues, to put them together to sort this issue out. Once you sort it out, it's pretty easy. I can explain the case against IP in 5 minutes to most intelligent people who have a attention span greater than a Cocker Spaniel, and I've done it many times. But so once you explain something in simple terms, it becomes easier to see, oh yeah, why wasn't that obvious before? Lots of things were obvious. I mean, marginal utilities theory, pioneered in the late 1800s by Menger and Clark and the other guy, the Swiss guy, and we're forgetting their names. But in retrospect, marginal value theory seems obvious to us, but it wasn't obvious to them. They had to solve the diamond water paradox. Anyway, after you figure something out, it becomes obvious, and that's how we make intellectual progress over the years. But the point is, I had to rethink some things we take for granted about property rights, and that's what my talk is about today. And to do that, you have to sometimes be willing to be asked dumb questions, or what appear to be dumb questions. And in law school, I was the guy that kind of annoyed people, but they kind of liked me because I would ask the questions everyone else wanted to ask but were too afraid to ask, the things that sounded dumb. I note that my friend Bob Murphy, who's an Austrian, does that too. That's one of his shticks. Is he's like, I wonder why people value things, but he's really trying to make you think about the concepts. And I did that as well. One of my friends, when I lived in Philadelphia and practiced there for a while, so I am a Philadelphia attorney of a type. His name is Steve Mendelson, and he wrote an article he sent to me. It's called "Confessions of a Law School Asshole," which he published when he was at Penn. Where he was also a law school asshole. And he said he would ask the questions like, he would just raise his hand in the middle of a class and say, "Excuse me, what's a tort?" Or what's a magistrate? That's when these law professors assume everyone knows what the law students know what they're talking about. And you go, I know what a judge is, but what the hell's a magistrate? So I did that. One thing that I noticed early in my career, one of my first mentors in patent law was a guy named Bill Norvell in Houston, and he taught me the way you write a patent application is you interview the inventors, who are usually engineers. And patent lawyers have a unique combination of, we know the technology because we have engineering degrees, but we have law degrees too. So we know the legal part and the patent office practice part and the legal part, and then we know how to write and communicate, unlike a lot of engineers. And we know how to communicate. So we're like the translators. We translate between the law and the engineers. And so you have to learn how to do engineer speak. And engineers are tough to talk to sometimes because they take a lot of things for granted, and they're reluctant to say things that are obvious. They think everyone understands it. So you have to learn how to ask them questions. Anyway, Bill told me, bring a tape recorder with you, or dictaphone at those days. You record your interview, and then you get the typing pool to type it up, and you have your notes, and you can write the patent application from that. So I got good at asking these guys questions, but they would look at me like I was stupid sometimes, like, okay, what's a photon, or whatever. Don't you know what a photon is? Or even something more basic. But I'm just trying to get them to make sure I'm covering everything. And so then a weeks later, I would send them the draft patent application, and for them to review, and they would call me and they would say, "Damn, you weren't as stupid as you thought. You were actually listening." I said, "Yeah, sometimes if you listen, you can learn things." Anyway. Now, this gets to the point that when you drill down into something, it's really important to have precision and clarity of definitions. So we have to use words very carefully because lots of words have multiple meanings. And language is inherently analogical, right? We use a lot of analogies, and it's inherently imprecise. There's nothing we can do about that. It doesn't mean that it's open-ended, but there are lots of words with multiple meanings. And sometimes this leads to confusion because you get used to using words in a loose context. And if you're not careful, when you're dealing with a new issue, you have to go back to basics and make sure you're using terms carefully. Baum-Bauwerk, who is one of my favorite Austrian economists, an overlooked one of the mentors of Mises on the Misesian sort of side of things, he has a great essay called Whether Legal Rights and Relationships Are Economic Goods, and he has a comment that one requirement is essential, that economic theory avoid the error of confusing a practical habit indulged in for the sake of expediency with scientific truth. And what he's getting at is we have to be careful with, when you use a metaphor or an analogy, that's fine, but you have to be aware that it's just a metaphor and there's limits to these types of explanations. Here's some examples. So in the U.S., we libertarians say we're against government schools. We say that because the average person calls them public schools, which is confusing because in England, public schools are private schools, but that's a whole different issue. But that's another example. In England, the government means the administration. In America, the administration is the Trump administration, but the government doesn't stop functioning when there's a government shutdown because the government is the state in America. We conflate those terms. In the UK, the government is what collapses when the state still exists. So there's all these different uses of terms. But so I say government schools now, like libertarians do. And another thing is, like, we libertarians say we're against coercion. Well, we're not. We're against aggression. And we're careful to point out that we're against the initiation of force, which is what aggression is. But we're not against force or violence per se, right? Defensive force is fine. The same is true of coercion. Coercion just means getting someone to do something, compelling them to do something with a threat of force. But the threat of force could be justified. You know, if someone's robbing me, and I can capture them and hold them until the police arrive, I'm coercing them with a threat of force. That's legitimate. So we're not against coercion. We're against, you have these libertarians who call themselves voluntarists. And the problem with that terminology is, number one, we have a word already. It's called libertarianism. The left hasn't stolen it yet, like they stole the word liberal. But so we still have the word libertarian, but they say voluntarist. But the problem is, a better word would, if you want to use a new word, you should say consensualist. Like, we're for consent. Like, we think that you can't use someone's body or their resources without their permission, their consent. But voluntary just means you're doing it of your own free will. You know, if a robber coerces me by pointing a gun at me to hand over my wallet, that act of handing the wallet over is voluntary. It's coerced. It's not consensual. I didn't consent to it without coercion, right? So the word voluntary is a bad word. Or voluntarism is a bad word in my view because it's just a misuse of the word. Anyway, today's talk is about property, and as Hans Hermann Hoppe says, he's one of the most important living social theorists, and especially libertarian and Austrian theorists. He wrote this in his Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, his great 1989 book. Next to the category of action, right? And remember, action is the fundamental category of economics, and that's what Mises called his book Human Action. It's about the structure and the nature of human action and the consequences of action. That's what economics is about. Okay, so action is the fundamental presupposed fact of human life, that we all act, we pursue means and ends. That's what action is. Okay, so Hoppe says, next to the concept of action, property is the most basic category in the social sciences. As a matter of fact, all other concepts to be introduced in this chapter, aggression, contract, capitalism, and socialism, are definable in terms of property. Aggression being aggression against property. Contract being a non-aggressive relationship between property owners. Cooperation. Socialism being an institutionalized policy of aggression against property. And capitalism being an institutionalized policy of the recognition of property and contractualism. So you can see how important the concept of property is. It's the most fundamental concept that we have next to action itself. Then Hoppe himself unpacks these terms, and he explains, he uses that unpacking to, say, get to the heart of socialism. We think of socialism as the state or collective ownership of the means of production, capital goods. But that's just one type of good. There's consumer goods. But Hoppe says, well, that's just the kind of main manifestation or application of it. But the essence of socialism is this institutionalized interference with private property rights. In other words, it's institutionalized aggression, as opposed to private crime, right? If you have a private criminal steal from you, he's a criminal. He's a little mini socialist, but he doesn't have an institution around him, so he's a private criminal. The state is criminality writ large. which you can understand once you boil socialism down to its essence. So that's the benefit of having an essentialist understanding of these concepts. Okay, now, as for property, we all have an intuitive understanding of property. We use the terms all the time. We say I act, I value, I do things, but we also say that car is my property. We use terms like that. But terminology becomes important when we say things like that car is my property, because when we talk about what the laws should be in society and what property rights the laws should be backing up and what property ought to be and is, then we need to think about these concepts, right? Now, why do we use the word property to talk about things like my car or my body or anything? This is from Yiannopoulos, who is deceased now, but he was a famous Greek law professor in Louisiana at Tulane. In his treatise on property, he writes, "The English word property derives from the Latin proprietus, a noun form of proprius, which means one's own. In the United States, the word property is frequently used to denote indiscriminately either the objects of rights or the rights that people have with respect to these things. However, if you want to be careful and precise," Yiannopoulos says, "accurate analysis should reserve the use of the word property for the designation of rights that persons have with respect to things." What he's getting at is that the word property doesn't technically mean the thing that you own. So when you say that car is my property, it's slightly misleading. What you mean to say is that that car is a thing, it's an ownable thing, it's a thing that I have a property right in. So there's a property right in the car. So if you want to be precise, you need to say, I have a property right in the car. You might think this is pedantic and niggling, but there's a reason for this. And the reason is when you drill down into these arguments, for example, in intellectual property, I will have someone say, well, Kinsella is against intellectual property law, which is true, which means he thinks ideas are not property. Okay, now think about that way of wording it. My argument is not that ideas are not property, right? Because the car is not property. The car is a thing that I have a property right in, right? So the question for property rights in the real world is always a question of who is the owner of a thing, who has a property right in the thing. And that's what property rights do, is they determine and they assign ownership with certain rules, right? And the thing that you own is a thing. So the question is never, is that thing property? The question is that thing over which there can be conflict, who's the owner of it? So we look at the property rights rules or the laws to determine that, right? So the question is not, is that thing property or not? So my argument for IP, against IP, is not that it's not property. It would be more, we can't get into it today, but it would be that it's not the type of thing over which there can be conflict, right? So that property rights apply to them in the first place. But the fundamental question is, what are property rights and what are the rules that are just and that we need to use in society for them to work, right? There's one more subtle thing which I want to point out here. When you start unpacking the concept of property, most people think of property, if you boil it down, they think it's a right to use, right? It's basically possession is the physical manipulation and use of a resource in the world to get something done. And ownership is the legal right to do that, right? So ownership is the right to use something, whereas possession is the use of it, right? That's the distinction that Mises and others make. We have to distinguish possession from ownership, norms from facts. But it's not actually technically even a right to use, right? The right to property is a right to exclude. So having a right to something doesn't mean the right to do whatever you want with it, which we all recognize. Like there's a common expression, your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins, right? Everyone says that. And the lesson people draw from that is a false lesson. And the lesson they draw from that is that all property rights are limited. No property rights are absolute. So they'll use that kind of example to argue against the absoluteness of property rights. Why do they do that? They do that because people like me point out that one problem with intellectual property laws is that they limit people's property rights in their physical things, right? So your copyright or your patent can prevent me from using my factory to make an iPhone with rounded corners because you have a patent on that. Or it can prevent me from publishing the Harry Potter book because J.K. Rowling has a copyright on it, right? So, and then the response of the IP advocate is, well, it's okay if property rights in ideas limit your property rights in your factory, because all property rights limit property rights. After all, you can't swing your fist where your property right in your fist ends where my nose begins. And the mistake there is it's right there in the expression. The expression is not my property right in my fist ends where your nose begins. It's my swinging of my fist. That's an action, right? Once you understand that, property rights are limits on other people's actions. They're not limits on property rights, right? Which goes along with what I just said, that property rights are not the right to use, they're the right to exclude. Once you understand in that sense, you understand that there's no barrier to saying property rights are absolute. In fact, the reason I can't swing my fist at your head is because you have an absolute property right in your nose, right? It's the action of my swinging my fist that your property right in your nose prevents. One way to see this is to imagine I have a gun and I own the gun, and I can't I'm not allowed to use the gun to shoot you with it, unprovoked. And people might say, well, that means that your rights in your gun are limited. You can only use your gun for certain things, but not for other things. So your property rights in your gun are limited. Well, that's not correct, because if I have a stolen gun, right? Let's say I don't own the gun and I steal the gun. I'm a robber and I stole the gun. I'm still not permitted to shoot someone with the gun, right? So I don't have a right to do anything with that gun because I don't own the gun. So the reason I can't shoot the gun at an innocent person is because they own their body. So their property rights in their body limit my actions, right? So people's property rights are limits on others' actions. They're not limits on property rights. So that's another nuance of property it's important to understand. And one other final thing is people say things like, what's a property right? You'll have a law student, he might be asked this question in his first year of law school in property. What's a property right? He'll say, well, it's a relationship between me and my car. It's like, really? I didn't know people had relations with cars, right? So, and if you think about this, Robinson Crusoe, alone on an island, well, he wouldn't have a car. He wouldn't have a division of labor to have a car, but he has a coconut, right? So Crusoe possesses a coconut or a fish that he caught, but he has no property rights in the fish or the coconut. He doesn't own the fish because there's no other people around to respect his rights. There's no other people around to violate his rights. There's no other people around to steal his coconut. So he only has possession. He doesn't have ownership, right? And so this gets at the point that property rights are relationships between people with respect to things. So when I say I own that car, what I'm really saying in a simple way to compress it is I have a property right in that car with respect to meaning other people have to respect my exclusive right to use that car. So it's a property right with respect to the car, but it's a right between people. So that's what the property rights are rights between people, is the point here. And I've already mentioned that property rights are a limit on action. They're not a limit on property. Now, back to this question of terminology in this proprius word, and when we say property or rights and things that we own, I think the reason that we'll say that car is my property is because, think about the word property or characteristics. When we describe the identity or nature of a thing, like this water bottle, it has a color, it has a weight, it has a mass, it has a location, it has an age, it has a composition, it has a shape, it has lots of features that define what it is. Some are incidental, some are important, but I own this bottle. But do I own its maroon color? No, it has a maroon color. Do I own its weight? No. These are features or characteristics of the thing, right? Now, when we act in the world, to act, according to human action and praxeology of Mises, it means to be in the present and be aware. We're acting people with brains and minds. We're not stupid beings. We have some awareness of our situation. Our situation is we live in the world. We live in a world of causal laws, cause and effect. We live in a world with a past. We know there's a past. We have memory, and we have a history. We live in the present now, and we have a future that's coming. We all know this, and we know the future is uncertain. At least some of us are supposed to know that. And so what we do is we have what Mises calls this psychological effect of uneasiness. It's just his general description of the motivation that impels us to act. But action is unavoidable. It's impossible to act unless you die. Every moment of your life, you're acting, which means you're thinking about the future, and something about it drives you nuts or makes you uneasy. You realize that this is about to happen in the future. Some point in the future, something is going to occur, and I don't like it. I don't like what's going to happen. Like, I might be hungry. I might feel this hunger, and I realize if I don't find some food, in about an hour, I'm going to be miserable, right? So I start looking for food. So what people do is they see the future. They're aware of ways they can change it. They can intervene. So in a sense, what we do in life is we act by grabbing things in the world, by manipulating them, by grappling with them, and by manipulating things that are causally efficacious. That's what means of actions are. That means causally efficacious means they work. A rain dance doesn't work. If I want it to rain and I dance, it's not going to make it rain. So that's an irrational action, right? But if I want to catch a fish and I know that fish will feed me and they won't poison me, and that one way to do it is to get a spear or make a net, I'm doing rational things by employing resources in the world, including my body, to get things done. That's what all action is aiming at a future end. We're trying to change the future. We're trying to change the future universe that's coming. So we're effectively, in every action we're trying to do, we're trying to make the world be different than it would be. So the ultimate general result of all human action is aiming at an end, but the end is changing the future state of the world. Now, we think of that in commercial terms now as trying to make a profit or trying to get ownership of a thing. If I buy a bunch of bananas from a supermarket, the goal of my action was to get ownership of those bananas and possession. So use and ownership of the bananas, right? Or if I sell products, I'm trying to make a monetary profit. That's only one subset of types of actions. In fact, it's a small subset. You could come up with 99 out of 100 actions that you perform on a daily basis, which have nothing to do with monetary profit and have nothing to do with acquiring ownership of an object. If I want to see a sunset here in Vancouver, I might stay up at night to watch it. That's the goal of my action, and if I do it, I succeed. And instead of monetary profit, we call that psychic profit. So psychic profit is the general feature of human action. Okay. This is the way we have to conceive of action. And why does it matter? It matters because every action employs these scarce resources or scarce means of action, and their purpose is to manipulate things and to change the course of events. So that's what resources are. They're things that we employ and grapple and grasp. That's why property is important. So if I'm a caveman from 10,000 years ago, I might use animal skin to clothe myself, right, to protect me, or I might use a club or a spear. So I start using these tools to enhance my daily activities, right? So they become an extension of myself. So just like this water bottle is maroon and my phone is rectangular, that's a property of those things, right? Or a feature or a characteristic of those things. So Kinsella has a spear. That's one of his properties. He's a hunter. He's a guy with a spear, right? Or Kinsella is a fast runner, so running is one of my properties, right? So we start using the properties of things to identify with the thing itself. It's a way of describing what it does. So I think it's natural that we say, well, Kinsella has a car. He owns the car. It's his car because it's a property of himself. It's an extension of himself, right? So in other words, resources are useful. That's why we use them. So we call them our property, even though technically speaking, they're not our property. They're things that we have property rights in. Okay. Now, one thing I've alluded to is the distinction between ownership and possession. Now, this gets to a normative issue, right? So Robinson Crusoe, I learned this recently, by the way. I've been using this example for years. Robinson Crusoe alone on his island. Mises, Rothbard, they use this example. They do it to isolate things. There are two types of hypotheticals that are used in social sciences. One are realistic things that are just unlikely, and one are impossible things. Like impossible things would be the evenly rotating economy of Mises, because you can't imagine a world like that, right? Because the future is uncertain. But in a world where you isolate this, you're trying to isolate what interest is and things like that. So that's an impossible scenario, the evenly rotating economy. But it is possible to have a world without money, like a barter world. And it is possible to be stranded on an island like Crusoe. It's just not the common scenario, right? So that's still a hypothetical. But the point is you pick these hypotheticals to isolate certain features for analysis. So Crusoe on his island doesn't have ownership rights of anything. He has possession. He has possession of means. So human action still applies to him. But one thing he's missing is social intercourse with other people, right? He doesn't live in society. So he's missing the benefits and the drawbacks of living in society, right? Hell is other people, in a way. He's alone, he's happy, he's a hermit, but he doesn't have the benefits of community with other people. He doesn't have company, he doesn't have love, he doesn't have family, he doesn't have the ability to trade with other people. There's no division of labor. So there's limits, right? On the other hand, there's no one around that can rob him or kill him or steal from him. There might be lions and tigers, but those are, as Hoppe calls, mere technical problems. They're not they're not moral problems. You can't reason with a lion or a tiger, and some people increasingly nowadays. But when other people enter the picture, now we have a different world. We have the normal world. We have a world where we have other people that we care about and that care about us. We have the benefits of culture and education and society and law, and and division of labor and specialization of labor and trade. But we also have the fact that other people have free will and they're not governed by these causal laws. Like the laws that we come up with, like you shouldn't do this, those are norms. Those are prescriptive laws. They're not causal laws. You can't violate the laws of physics. If you don't agree with the law of gravity, it doesn't care whether you agree with it or not. You can't, if you jump off the 10th story of a building, you're going to die, right? So that's a causal law. That shows the difference in the Austrian field of the difference between causal phenomena and teleological phenomena, right? There's a difference between the way causal laws work. They're descriptive of the world, and normative laws, right? Or teleological laws, things that describe what we should do, what we ought to do, and why we value things. Anyway. So the point is, when you enter society, there's a risk that other people have free will and they might disrespect your possession of a resource. So now the possession is not enough to use it. Now you have to lock it up or guard it or threaten people not to take it. That's expensive and that's time consuming. And so over time, when you have a civilized society and people share enough common values that they all value cooperation and peace and the division of labor and each other's thriving and well-being, they tend to favor the widespread social recognition of the possession people have in an economic sense in terms of property rights, right? We'll say, not only do you possess that house or that fish or whatever, or your body, but you should have it, and other people should leave you alone. So over time, these property rights emerge. That's what property rights are. So property rights are what I call the normative support for possession, right? So that's what ownership is. Ownership is the normative support for possession. So in addition to having a lock on my front door of my home, I can also call the cops, right? If someone wants to break in, and they will enforce my property rights. So that's what property rights are, and that's the purpose. That's the purpose of them. Mises, by the way, saw this. He was grappling with this. He used the wrong terms. And he actually changed over time because, remember, he was early. I think in socialism, he distinguished what he called he called what we would call possession. He called it ownership, but he called it sociological ownership. And then later he changed it to catalactic ownership when he came up with the term catalaxy. That's another confusing term that simply means a society that has money. It's not a barter society. But the point is, Mises distinguished what he called catalactic or sociological ownership, by which he meant possession. He distinguished that from juristic or legal ownership, which is what we normally mean by that. So even in Mises' terminology, he understood that there's a difference. Like human action, economic science analyzes the consequences and implications of human action, which is not normative at all, has nothing to do with property rights. It's just the fact that people live in the world and they possess and use these resources to achieve ends in the future. Let's analyze the implications of that. That applies to Crusoe, it applies to people in society. What economists do now is they take into account, they take for granted these legal norms which have arisen in society on top of the structure of possession, right? So we have possession, and now we have ownership. But economists are sometimes sloppy too. So they'll say, like, and Bitcoin advocates, all these people, they'll say, oh, I own my Bitcoin. What they mean is you possess your Bitcoin because you have the technical ability to exclude people from using it. Like, you actually don't need property rights in Bitcoin because it's impossible for someone to so-called steal it, right? It's like if you had a house with a lock that was so impregnable no one could get into it. You wouldn't need property rights then because no one could violate the property. Then norms would collapse into reality. Prescription would collapse into description, right? There would only be causal laws, but we don't live in that world. But for some things, so for Bitcoin, people say you own it, but what they really mean is you possess it. And that distinction can be confusing because then you say, well, are you saying that you have a property right in the Bitcoin? What they really mean is practically you can use it. Okay, so it's important to keep these things separate as well. How much time do I have? Okay, I'm not going to finish, but before I finish, let me say there's other observations that follow this, right? And I'm going to go with a few more. And I've spoken on those before, and I've written on them in my book. And then you can apply them to intellectual property. It's pretty easy once you build the superstructure, right? But let me make one more kind of final point. These property rights that emerge typically have a certain feature, and they have emerged in society, and they did emerge over the last 2,500 years or more, starting with the Roman law about 2,500 years ago, which lasted about 1,000 years, and then the English common law, which lasted about the last 1,000 years, right? Roughly 1,000-year reichs of legal dominance. And both of these systems and other more crude systems and international law to an extent and customary law and the modern versions of these systems, the modern versions of the law we have now is the Anglo-American common law based upon the 1,000-year English common law, which was partly based on the older Roman law, and the modern civil law of Latin America and Europe, which are civil code-based systems largely, which are based upon the principles developed on the Roman law. But all these systems have a core. And here's the thing. Libertarians will say something like, well, unlike you socialists, we believe in property rights. Well, that's actually not accurate. In a general sense, every society on earth has a property rights system and framework. Because property rights are just, again, the legally recognized right to control or exclude a resource. In other words, the system identifies who the owner is. That doesn't say who the system should identify the owner as. And in every system, there's an owner. I mean, if you have a totalitarian theocratic dictatorship, then the law says the king owns everything. Okay, there is an owner, right? And in fact, in the UK today, in a sense, the king is the overlord of the whole country. There's still a remnant of feudalism. Even in the U.S., this happened. In the 13 colonies, there's these called receiving statutes. After the U.S. Unfortunately seceded from Britain, they adopted the common law with receiving statutes. They said the common law that exists on this day from England is now our law. We're going to develop it going forward. But then the question became, well, and the common law was feudalistic, and it basically has this system of the king is the overlord, then you have the lords, then the serfs. You have this hierarchy of ownership. That's why we have these complicated terms in the common law, like fee simple and conveyance by deed. In the Roman law, it's a lot cleaner. You're just the owner. You're not a fee simple owner and all this kind of stuff. But the point is, in the Roman law and in all these systems, what the rules always say basically this. They're practical because, remember, possession is the base thing. People have to possess things to survive in the world. That means they have to acquire the things, right? So some guy's roaming around in the world and he sees, a plot of land, or he sees a tree with apples on it, or he sees a branch and he wants to make a spear out of it, and they're unowned. They're totally unowned, they're unclaimed, they're unpossessed, and he grabs it out of the state of nature and he starts using it. That's original appropriation in a possession sense, but when law arises, now he's got to have the right to that, the property right. And so all property rights recognize that original appropriation, sometimes called occupation, sometimes called homesteading, is the core first way that we come to own things, right? And it has to recognize that, because if it didn't recognize that, we would all die. You wouldn't have the right to do anything in the world. You wouldn't be the first one. Oh, and by the way, the more fundamental right is the right to your body. So when we say we're against aggression, what that means, that's another way of saying you own your body. So when you say you're against aggression or that you favor the non-aggression principle, that's just another way of saying that you favor property rights in people's bodies. In other words, when there's a body, which is a scarce resource, it's a scarce resource because there could be conflict over it, the question can arise, who owns that body? And the answer is not so obvious. It's obvious now, but it wasn't obvious in the past when there was slavery, right? Maybe the father owns his kids. Maybe the husband owns the wife. Maybe the king owns the serfs. Maybe the lord owns his serfs. Maybe the conqueror owns the slaves. Maybe the guy in America, in antebellum America, owns the black slave that he imported from Africa. I mean, slavery is conceptually possible, and it actually happens, right? So the question can emerge, who owns the person's body? And the libertarian answer, and the default answer of the private law, the common law, of the private law, is that the person owns himself. Okay, so self-ownership is the first principle of the law, of the private law. And then for other resources, the principles are basically the first person to get it, that's homesteading, or if you acquire it by contract. These three principles, plus one more, which I won't mention, rectification, are all you really need to answer the question, who owns that? And that's the core of the private law. And the libertarian law is simply a more consistent application of that. I will stop here, and maybe later I can answer any questions. Thank you very much.